Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beeker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Nebraska History Museum on the third Thursday of each month. A detailed schedule of this series, as well as information about Historical Society activities and programs, can be found at our website, www.nebraska.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would also like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Jim Potter has been with the Nebraska State Historical Society since 1967, or 68, 7, yeah. His latest book, and Jim's written a number of scholarly articles and several books, but his latest book is Standing Firmly by the Flag, Nebraska Territory in the Civil War. In conjunction with an upcoming museum exhibit on Nebraska Cowboys, the title in Jim's talk, and his title of his talk today is, quote, A Peculiar Set of Men, Nebraska Cowboys of the Open Range. Jim Potter.
Well, when I was a kid, I liked cowboys and saw a lot of them on TV and in the movies, so I suspect many of you are the same. As an American icon, the cowboy has few peers. The iconic cowboy began to emerge while the real one was still riding the open range. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show premiered in Omaha in 1883 and soon took the romanticized American cowboy abroad. Let me see here. There we go. Dime novels featuring cowboy daring do were common 19th century fare. Owen Wister's novel The Virginian in 1902 solidified the cowboy hero archetype. Then the Great Train Robbery in 1903 initiated a stream of Hollywood films and TV series that helped create and then diffuse the mythological cowboy worldwide. We even had our cowboy stars from Nebraska. Hoot Gibson, and his real name was Edmund, not Edward, was born in Tekamah, Nebraska, I believe 1892, something like that. And he went on to become quite a prominent Hollywood cowboy star of the 1920s, 30s, and on. Historian William Savage termed the cowboy, quote, the predominant figure in American mythology, but went on to add, historically, the cowboy was an individual of little or no significance. As Richard Slatta notes in his 1990 book, Cowboys of the Americas, the real, quote, the real old-time cowboy is only dimly visible in the new sanitized, politicized, symbolic cowboy, end quote. Slatta's conclusion applies as well to Nebraska's real old-time cowboys. While the work they did and the lives they led are generally understood, most of these hard-working, underpaid, transient laborers on horseback remain anonymous. One reason so little is known about most of the men who trailed the Longhorns north from Texas or worked Nebraska's open ranges in the 19th century is that the period in which they flourished was so brief. Again, quoting Slatta, extensive open-range ranching came and went in the American West in the space of a single lifetime. The day of the American and Nebraska cowboy lasted only from the end of the Civil War to about 1900. Subsequently, hired laborers on ranches, often still called cowboys, began to do much of their work as pedestrians while building fences, putting up hay, and repairing windmills. As former Nebraska cowboy James H. Cook put it in 1923, quote, a .45 caliber hammer, a sack of fence staples, and a wire cutter, splicer, and staple puller combined are all the tools needed by the modern cowboy, end quote. Horses for ranch work began to give way to pickup trucks, tractors, and later all-terrain vehicles. No longer was the cowboy exclusively an equestrian. Cattle drives from Texas to Great Plains railheads after the Civil War brought cowboys to Nebraska. As long as most of the cattle were shipped to market or delivered to Indian reservations instead of being put on the range, there was not much work to keep the cowboys in the state, and many returned to Texas. As the 1875 drives to Ogallala drew to a close, and this was the first year Ogallala was a major cattle destination, an observer summed it up, quote, 30,000 head of cattle have just been delivered to the Indian agencies north of here, and the herders returned yesterday on their way back to Texas. They are having a jolly time ere they start across the country ponyback a distance of 800 miles. Like discharged soldiers, they are free and generous with their money after being paid off and discharged. A majority of the herders here are young men, having made perhaps but 1 or 2 trips across the country, end quote. Even if they had not been born in the Lone Star State, the trail hands' arrival with the Longhorns made them all seem Texans. The Sydney Telegraph noted as much in August 1879, quote, a large number of the cowboys in this section are from Texas. In a recent conversation with one of them, we remarked how natural it was for a Texas boy to talk about stock, etc. Yes, he replied, we are brought up with it, commencing from boyhood, grow with it, and in many instances know nothing else but cattle and ponies, end quote. The 1880 federal and 1885 state population censuses for selected locales in Nebraska range country provide a glimpse of Nebraska cowboys' ages and origins. Through about 1880, both the census and the newspapers of the time tended to call these equestrian laborers herders rather than cowboys. Several herders enumerated in the 1880 census of Shidley's Ranch in Keith County and the Hunter and Evans Ranch on the Niobrara in present Sheridan County had been born in Texas or other states of the former Confederacy. But many were natives of Iowa, Kansas, Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and several foreign countries, including Canada, England, and Germany. The 1885 state census of the Hat Creek Basin, which is the northern portion of modern Sioux County, enumerated 76 cowboys working on 7 ranches. Collectively, the ranches had slightly more than 43,000 cattle on hand June 1st. The Sioux County cowboys, like their 1880 counterparts, had been born all across the United States and in several foreign countries, including Norway, France, and Mexico. 9 cowboys had been born in Iowa, 11% of the sample, followed by 7 Texas-born men, slightly more than 9%. Natives of Illinois were 7.9%, Missouri 6.6%, Mexico 6.6%, and New York 5.2%. No other state or country furnished more than 3 cowboys. Regardless of their nativity, many Nebraska cowboys got their start in Texas. James H. Cook was born in Michigan and went to Kansas, where a cattleman told him, quote, the best way to see the West was to get work with some cow outfit and go to Texas. After working on several cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, Cook hired on with an 1876 drive to a Dakota Territory Indian reservation and subsequently ended up in Nebraska as a Hunter and Evans cowboy before buying the 04 Ranch at Agate Springs in 1887, today the site of Agate Fossil Beds National Monument. Edward C. Teddy Blue Abbott, whose recollection "We Pointed Them North" is a classic, was born in England and grew up near Denton, Nebraska, right down the road here, before running away from home to become a cowboy. In Texas, Abbott signed on with I.P. Olive and returned to Nebraska in 1879 with a herd destined for the Olive Ranch on the Loop. Quote, it was easy to get a job, said Abbott. The cow outfits were looking for men, and every town you went to in Texas, they'd tackle you to go north with a herd, end quote. Some Nebraska cowboys were black. Notable examples were Amos Harris, born a slave in Galveston, and James Kelly, birthplace unknown, the latter said to have come to Nebraska with olive herds from Texas. Harris and Kelly remained in Nebraska for the rest of their lives, often working as cowboys. While black cowboys were usually sprinkled here and there among their mostly Anglo counterparts, the Sydney newspaper mentioned the 1885 passage of a herd for the Bay State Range, quote, that was in charge of an outfit of colored cowboys, boss and all, end quote. Historian Richard Slatta estimated that about 5,000 black cowboys helped trail herds north from Texas between 1866 and 1895. Given the vaquero origins of the American cowboys trade, it is not surprising that many were of Hispanic ancestry. The Olives employed Mexicans, including one Pedro Dominicus, who was on the payroll at the time of the 1878 killing of homesteaders Mitchell and Ketchum by Olive cowboys in Custer County. Another man, known as Mexican Leon, was reported by Teddy Abbott as having been murdered by Print Olive's brother Ira on the Republican River about 1878. Abbott also recalled that although white Southerners such as the Olives were strongly prejudiced against blacks and Mexicans, quote, they hired them because they worked cheaper than white men, end quote. Early Nebraska ranchman John Bratt remembered that in 1870, quote, our employees, some 20 or 30, were mostly Texans or Mexicans, end quote. 5 of the cowboys listed in the 1885 census of Sioux County were natives of Mexico. Most of the cowboys listed in the 1880 census were in their 20s, although several were teenagers. The same youthfulness was typical of the Sioux County cowboys in 1885, with men in their 20s making up nearly 66% of the sample. Slightly more than 9% were teenagers, while nearly 20% were in their 30s. Only 4 men older than 30 were listed as cowboys. Older men often worked as foremen or cooks, but John Graham of the Hunter Ranch, aged 38 in 1880, was still listed as a herder. 14 of the 1885 cowboys were recorded as being married, although their wives were not with them. The youth of the cowboys in the census conforms to recollections by several Nebraskans. Nels Rowley, who settled in Cherry County, said he was 17 when he got his first job in 1879 on a ranch near North Platte. Edward C. Abbott, Teddy Blue, was 18 when he made his first trail drive in 1879. James H. Cook was in his teens when he drove cattle from Texas in the mid-1870s. Bartlett Richards, one of Nebraska's most noted cattlemen and rancher, was not yet 17 when he left Massachusetts in 1879 to work as a cowboy on a Wyoming ranch. Whether trailing longhorns from Texas to Ogallala or making the spring and fall roundups from the Nebraska ranges, the cowboy worked on horseback. The drives began in Texas in February or March with the goal of getting the cattle to the Platte Valley by September 1st at the latest. Quote, we try to get them up here earlier by July 1st through the 10th, reported Texas cattleman Seth Mabry in 1875. According to Mabry's fellow cattlemen Eugene B. Millett and Dillard R. Fant, quote, when this cattle driving business first began, 500 was thought to constitute an immense herd, but now 2,500 to 4,000 are brought up at a time, end quote. Managing herds of this size on the trail required fewer cowboys than one might expect. Millett and Fant said about 11 men, one of whom was the trail boss and the other was the cook, were needed for a herd of 2,500. James H. Cook helped drive a similar-sized herd from Texas to Dakota Territory in 1876. Quote, there were 10 of us, including our trail boss and the cook, end quote. James C. Dahlman, who came north with Texas cattle in 1878 and remained in Nebraska after his cowboy days were over, said 11 men could handle a herd of 2,000 to 3,000. And Dahlman, some of you probably know, went on to become what became known as the Cowboy Mayor of Omaha in the teens and 1920s, and sort of the perpetual mayor of that town, but he was a former cowboy. Once numerous Nebraska open-range ranches had been established by the mid to late 1870s, cowboys could find employment here if they did not want to stick to driving herds from Texas. Like the trail hands, the open-range cowboys' busy season was in the spring and summer when the main roundup took place and calves were branded. Sometimes a smaller fall roundup was held to cull marketable animals for shipping. In his March 1878 address as president of the Lincoln County Stock Growers Association, John Bratt estimated that there were some 200,000 head of cattle in Nebraska west of the 100th meridian, quote, giving employment to 600 men. The first systematic roundups began in Nebraska about 1875, the same year that the Western Stock District, which constituted Lincoln, Keith, and Cheyenne counties, as well as adjacent unorganized territory, was created by the legislature. And then the Stock Growers Association of Western Nebraska was organized. Although the roundup season was shorter than the trail season, the work was more complicated than simply moving cattle from place to place. Each roundup district might cover a large territory over which the herds of from 5 to 10 cow outfits ranged. Each district appointed a foreman, and each outfit therein provided cowboys, horse wranglers, a cook, and a mess or chuck wagon. As with the trail drives, each cowboy furnished his own bedding and equipment, but the herd owner supplied the saddle horses, usually 8 to 10 per man. A June 1876 article by an individual the newspaper described as, quote, one of the finest riders on the roundup, appeared in the North Platte Western Nebraskian. The correspondent wrote of the skills employed by the cowboys and their horses, quote, no horsemanship can excel that which is displayed by an experienced cowboy. As they dash over the rough prairie at the top of their Mustang's speed, avoiding great numbers of holes, the work of prairie dogs and our family of subsoilers, the utter disregard of their peril is something as courageous as it is rash. No matter what distance the cutting horse has traveled, how fatigued it may be, the moment you ride it into the herd, every muscle, every faculty is on the alert, and the intelligence they display is almost human, end quote. While many cowboys were no doubt highly skilled, contemporary accounts suggest that one did not need to be a superlative horseman, roper, or crack shot to do the job. Bay State Foreman James Shaw in 1884 said, quote, any man who is not afraid of work and who can ride a horse and possesses good common sense can get along well enough. A man doesn't have to throw a lasso like a Mexican vaquero nor shoot a revolver like a 10-cent novel Texas Ranger to be a good cowboy. But he must have good nerve, not be afraid of getting tired once in a while, and he must stick to his knitting rain or shine, end quote. Charlie O'Keefe, who worked as a cowboy on Sheridan County ranches, offered a similar assessment. Quote, among the scores of cowpunchers that I knew personally between 1884 and 1898, none were crack shots, although they could all shoot straight enough when the need arose, such as for the purpose of chasing off some sneaky coyote or ending the sufferings of a horse who had broken his leg and could not be saved. Most of these boys were good horsemen, handy with the rope for legitimate uses, and all capable of doing the daily tasks on the average ranch. While the employers generally furnished the horses, the cowboy provided his own saddle, bridle, lariat, firearms, and clothing. Rolfe Johnson, who was a young homestead lad from Phelps County, went to Sydney in 1879 on a trip, and he saw cowboys there and described them. Quote, the usual equipment of a herder or cowboy is a white, broad-brimmed hat, a blue woolen shirt with wide collar and silk necktie, leather leggings or buckskin breeches fringed at the seams, fine tight boots, an old army overcoat, a belt around his waist full of cartridges, 1 or 2 Colts 6-shooters, a Bowie knife, a Winchester rifle, a pair of big spurs, and last, though most important, a small Indian pony with a big saddle, end quote. During his cowboy days in Wyoming, Bartlett Richards wrote, quote, I wear a blue flannel shirt, blue trousers tucked in my tall boots, tremendous great spurs, everyone wears them, broad-brimmed light felt hat, and leather chaparrals, which are like trousers. I have a war bag, that is to say, a common flour sack with one change of clothing in it, a towel, tooth, and hairbrush. The last was quite unnecessary and does not belong in a true cowpuncher's outfit, or to tell the truth, any of the last three." End quote. Most cowboys slept in the open while on a drive or roundup, covered only by their saddle blanket or a tarpaulin. Sleep itself was at a premium because controlling the cattle day and night took precedence. A cowboy on an 1876 trail drive from Texas told a newspaper correspondent, quote, "It is 17 months since I have slept under shelter or been inside of a house," end quote. Another hand working a Nebraska roundup that same year mentioned that he had not slept for 3 nights. Quote, "On inquiry, his reply was last night, tonight, and tomorrow," end quote. The cowboys on trail drives or roundups were fed from a mess or chuck wagon, and the cook worked longer hours than the other men. As for food, ranch man John Bratt recalled, quote, "In the early roundup days, we would depend much on wild game, shoulders and bacon, beans, syrup, sugar, coffee, soda bread, or biscuits, and sometimes honey," end quote. Later, canned goods were often available, along with baking powder biscuits. Absent wild game, the men could butcher a steer. Bartlett Richards in 1879 had fresh meat often, along with potatoes, canned tomatoes, oatmeal, rice, tea and coffee, sugar, white and brown, always some kind of dried fruit. He said, quote, "One drawback was everything is fried in grease," end quote. Ed Monroe did not fare as well on an 1883 roundup in the Sandhills, complaining about, quote, "Yellow soda bread, strong bacon, muddy coffee, burnt beans," end quote. Working constantly on horseback, the cowboy's job was dangerous, particularly due to the nasty disposition and the size of the cattle he had to manage. Only the largest and strongest could stand the drive from Texas, and longhorns were generally kept on the range until 4 years old. By then, a steer could weigh well over 1,000 pounds. An Omaha newspaper man visiting a cattle drive on the Republican River noted, quote, "The Texan steer is one of the wickedest and most unmanageable wild beasts in the world when not moving with the herd," end quote. While cowboys would not voluntarily go afoot in the midst of a herd, or at most other times for that matter, they were sometimes unhorsed during the mad scramble to control a stampede, an accident that could prove fatal. Stampedes often occurred at night, sometimes caused by thunderstorms, and the horses risked stumbling into animal burrows or plunging over cut banks during the headlong rush in the dark. Teddy Blue Abbott, among others, told of cowboys being killed during stampedes. In one instance, the cowboy and his horse were, quote, "mashed into the ground as flat as a pancake. The only thing you could recognize was the handle of his 6-shooter. In other cases, cowboys or ranch owners suffered severe injuries or death doing what seemed to be routine work. In 1880, John C. Henry, a Custer County cattleman, was cutting out from a herd at the Loup River Roundup when his horse stumbled, threw Henry off, and then fell on him. Henry died 3 hours later. Ed Wilder broke his leg when he was thrown from his horse while working cattle near Sydney in 1875. The elements, including lightning and blizzards, were constant hazards to men whose work kept them outdoors. John Shipman, a Newman Ranch cowboy, was killed by a stroke of lightning in 1878. Lewis Billy the Bear Iager, while working as a cowboy in Wyoming, got caught in a January 1883 blizzard and froze off his lower legs and feet, or it froze them so bad they had to be amputated. Billy the Bear later settled in Chadron, and he spent a long life there in various public endeavors, such as clerk of the county court and so on, and he left a diary which the Dawes County Historical Society published a number of years ago, not about his cowboy days, but about his life in Chadron after his feet had gotten frozen off. Pretty interesting stuff. But this is before the blizzard, of course. He would have been even shorter in this picture otherwise. Other cowboys drowned while crossing streams on horseback, including William Wheeler on the North Platte River in 1884 after his horse stepped into a deep hole that unseated him. Indians were also an occasional threat to lone cowboys riding in the vastness of the sandhills. James Williamson was killed near the Snake River on May 5, 1879, said to be by Brule Sioux from Spotted Tail's Rosebud Reservation located to the north. In late July 1880, Lang Brothers ranch foreman Jasper Souther disappeared during the annual roundup. Subsequently, the Indian agent at Rosebud learned that a small agency band had killed a white man in the Sandhills while it was on a horse-stealing expedition. 6 Indians were arrested and held at Fort Randall for trial, but released for lack of evidence well before Souther's skeleton was finally discovered by a fellow cowboy in December of 1882. The life of a cowboy, with all of its dangers and discomforts, clearly had an attraction for adventurous young men, but the pay could not have been the main incentive. Throughout the period from about 1870 to 1890, the average monthly wage ranged from $30 to $40. In 1875, Texas cattleman D.H. Snyder said that trail drivers used to be paid $60 to $75 a month when the cowboys furnished their own horses, but, quote, now we furnish the horses and pay them $25 to $39 a month, end quote. These low wages were further diluted because most cowboys were laid off during the winter when the cattle were simply left to fend for themselves. When asked what became of these men, the Bay State foreman James Shaw responded, quote, they go somewhere, either east or to the mountain towns, and get work at something else for the winter. A good many go to their homes in the east or south and come back in the spring. There is always a supply comes in when needed. The boys naturally come out for work just as harvest hands turn up in farming communities, end quote. Some cowboys drifted from ranch to ranch during the off-season, picking up odd jobs in return for a place to sleep and eat. This practice was known as riding the grub line. Conflicting stereotypes have grown up about cowboys' character and behavior. One version holding that they were honest, generous, big-hearted, and loyal, while another portrays them as lazy, immoral, backward, and prone to violence. As Richard Slatta has observed, quote, cowboys were no paragons of virtue, as many romantics and popularizers would have it, nor were they the uncouth barbarians of the plains described by self-anointed spokesmen of civilization and culture, end quote. Perceptions of cowboys often depended upon when or where observers encountered them, or whether they had actually met cowboys at all. That cowboys were seen as different is reflected by published contemporary accounts that referred to them as a peculiar race, rare birds, a wonderful creature, or a peculiar set of men. During the early open range years, most townsfolk saw cowboys only when they finished weeks or months of hard, dangerous work on the trail or roundup and came to town to resupply and blow off steam with alcohol, gambling, or women. In this setting, violence often resulted. Sensational events, such as the killing of Custer County homesteaders Mitchell and Ketchum by Print Olive and his cowboys in 1878, and the trials that followed, shaped many Nebraskans' perception of cowboy behavior. Most Nebraskans, even those living in cattle country, rarely saw cowboys engaged in the work with cattle that occupied most of their time. Most of the fatal encounters were between cowboys themselves, and they sometimes had racial overtones. In October 1875, a Texan got into a fight with a Mexican cowboy temporarily assigned to cook for the outfit. After sparring with knives and frying pans around the campfire, the Texan got in a fatal stroke and left his adversary, quote, to bake in the fire like a Texas yam, end quote. In September 1879, the Omaha Weekly Bee reported that an Anglo cowboy had fatally shot a Mexican at a ranch near Big Springs during a dispute over which of them was the best roper. Instances of cowboys being involved in gunplay with civilians or law officers also occurred. Examples include the so-called Cowboy Raid on Kearney that took place in October 1874, when several Texas herders running the town were wounded, one fatally by citizens' gunfire. And then the September 1875 murder by Texas cowboy Jordan Smith, shown here, of Milton Collins, a Kearney farmer who was protesting damage to his cornfield by the herders' horses. In July 1879, Deputy Sheriff Joe Hughes of Ogallala killed 2 Hunter and Evans cowboys in a shootout when the men resisted arrest for promiscuous shooting on the street. It should be added, however, that Hughes used a shotgun and did not face down the cowboys at high noon in the middle of the street. During the 1870s, Nebraska newspapers recorded some 14 fatalities from cowboy violence, some taking place in town and some on the range. After the July 1879 shootout in Ogallala, city fathers adopted an ordinance requiring cowboys visiting town to turn in their guns until such time as they were ready to leave for camp. A North Platte newspaper called it, quote, a sensible precautionary measure which should be enforced in our city, end quote. Unfortunately, it did not mark the end of fatalities by gunfire in Ogallala. Once cowboys became fixtures on Nebraska ranches and were encountered more frequently, perceptions of their behavior and character began to change. While violent incidents still occurred and were reported in the local press, these outbreaks were usually attributed to the influence of alcohol or because one of the antagonists deliberately picked a fight. Contrasting with the North Platte Western Nebraskans' 1875 condemnation of, quote, bloodthirsty Texas herders, end quote, the same paper in 1881 rose to the Cowboys' defense when it reported, quote, scores of cowboys in town this week getting ready for the roundup. They deported themselves like men and gave the lie to the false stories that are told about them so often and so freely in papers published in the tenderfoot regions down east. End quote. When an apparently sensational and inaccurate article about cowboys appeared in the Philadelphia Times, the Sydney Telegraph editor was indignant. Quote, if these tenderfoot correspondents possessed a little more brains and good sense, it would be better for the human race. Our cowboys of Nebraska and Wyoming are perfect gentlemen, full of life, energy, and all that makes a man. John Bratt devoted a chapter in his Reminiscences to stories about some of the cowboys who worked for him during his years in the cattle business. While there were a few miscreants among them, Bratt characterized most as, quote, whole-souled, generous, big-hearted, and ever faithful. Although a bit of nostalgia likely crept into the elderly ranchman's recall of his trails of yesterday, as he titled his book, it seems clear that his relations with his cowboys were a highlight of his life. By the later 1880s, the day of Nebraska's open-range cowboy was nearly done. The wild, unruly herders of the early years had become respected community members who did not always have to frequent saloons or gambling halls to enjoy themselves. And the latter institutions, while still present, were no longer the main attractions once towns such as Ogallala and Sydney moved beyond their turbulent years as cattle emporiums. The changes are suggested by the Keith County News report of a fall 1886 gathering of local cowboys unwinding from the summer's work. Quote, the Ogallala Cattle Company's punchers had oyster suppers at the Palace Restaurant Wednesday and Thursday night. The cowboys enjoyed themselves immensely. End quote. That same issue noted, quote, the cowboys from the North Country had their annual fair and circus last night after a hard summer's work. The boys are perfectly good-natured in their fun, end quote. By 1888, the few remaining large open-range cattle outfits, such as the Bay State and the Ogallala Land and Cattle Company, were moving their herds to Wyoming and Montana, where open range was still available. Both the Sydney and Ogallala newspapers took note. When 75 Bay State cowboys came to Sydney in late May 1888, preparing for, quote, what will probably be the last general roundup through this section of the country, the editor noted, quote, as the cavalcade rode slowly out of town, there were not a few among the watching spectators who regretted that the cowboy had gone, never to return to this region again, end quote. A month earlier, the Keith County News published a poem entitled "The Cowboys Farewell" that had been, quote, handed in this week by the Cowboys of the Platte, of whom a large number were in town during the present week, but there were only a handful compared with the crowds that gathered at Ogallala in the days when the Texas cattle drive and roundups were the only employment for an army of cattlemen commonly called cowboys. As the song indicates, the days of the cowboy are past, and they depart with the well wishes of the settlers who, though in a position that conflicts with the cowboys' interests, are generally of the opinion that a more gentlemanly class of men never roamed in any country." End quote. By the early 20th century, about all that remained of open-range cowboy life was nostalgia. It found expression with the founding at Valentine in September 1912 of the Northwestern Roundup, a reunion of former cowboys. Quote, "Their meetings were to remember old times, days of the cow trails, roundups, cattle rustling, and other routine or interesting happenings of bygone days." End quote. The organization met annually and had about 250 members at its peak. By the time the Northwestern Roundup folded in 1921, many of the members were elderly and others had passed away, along with almost everything from the old times that had inspired them to meet in the first place. Thank you very much. I would like to call your attention to the exhibit that sparked this talk. Really, it's going to be opening here at the museum this fall. You can see the dates, September 23rd. It'll be up all next year through the 5th of January 2015. And I should mention that this is an exhibit that's got some different elements than many we do. We've been borrowing some of the best cowboy items from around the museums around the state, and you're going to see some things that are pretty hard to see unless you travel a lot. You'll see them all here in one place. I might mention one of the world's only surviving plastic saddles, which belongs to the museum out in the Legacy of the Plains Museum in Gering, is going to be in the exhibit. And that was an innovation after World War II when there was apparently a leather shortage. So a guy in Alliance and a guy in Lusk, Wyoming decided to try to start making saddles out of plastic, and they made some. And we're going to have one of those in the exhibit. Variety of other things we borrowed from museums around the state, and I'm not going to spill the beans on everything, but I think you ought to come down and see this exhibit when we open it, and you'll have plenty of time because it's going to be open all next year. With that, I'd be glad to take any questions. Yes, sir.
So you paint a picture that Nebraska Cowboys were a 20 or 25-year, 30-year, 35-year phenomenon.
Well, I'm saying the open range cowboy period, yes.
And I suppose only tangentially do you know about other states, but is that because farming took over so fast from the Homestead Act and such, and is what existed in Texas or New Mexico or Wyoming, Montana, that last a longer period of time?
The question was about how long the open range period might have lasted elsewhere and why was Nebraska's period comparatively brief. Well, certainly settlement had quite a bit to do with it. You can detect that in Nebraska at least. But when the Ogallala paper, who had started talking about we need to get settlers in here, we can't live forever on the cattle trade. And of course part of it was the fact that the government passed laws against fencing off the open range, which some of the large cattle spreads had started to do, and a variety of things. In Nebraska too, you had the sand hills, which then and now are cattle country, but then with the Kincaid Homestead Act of 1904, a lot of people started claiming little homesteads in there. So it took quite a while for the cattlemen to sort of reclaim parts of Nebraska. I think certainly some of the open range frontiers in other places, even up into Canada, lasted somewhat longer. I'm not an expert on that, but if you want to read a good book about American cowboys as well as cowboys in other countries such as South America. That book I mentioned by Richard Slatta called Cowboys of the Americas was published in 1990. It's a good study of cowboys across North and South America, and it'll address some of these questions a little better than I can, since I haven't really focused on some of the other places. Yes, sir.
Were there any slaughterhouses like in Ogallala, or did some of the cattle get shipped to Omaha to slaughterhouses?
Well, eventually they did. The question was, were there any slaughterhouses in Ogallala? No, I don't think so. Ogallala really wasn't much except a bunch of cattle pens and saloons, and maybe a couple of so-called hotels. They started to, there was a group of these cattlemen that saw the need to have a market closer than Chicago for slaughtering cattle, for selling cattle, and they tried to start an Omaha stockyards in the late 1870s, which lasted for a very short time and then went out of business, didn't survive. So the Omaha stockyards, as we know it, that later became the largest stockyards in the world, it actually was incorporated, I think, in 1883. So in the latter part of this open range period, certainly there was a closer market. But I don't think they ever slaughtered the cattle right on the spot. They shipped them on the rails, which is, of course, why these towns sprang up as emporiums. I didn't address in my talk much, but a lot of these Texas cattle were coming north to feed the Indians, including the reservations in Nebraska or the agencies in Nebraska. So in the 1870s, late 1870s, we still had Indian agencies on the Nebraska side of the line, the Red Cloud Agency up near Fort Robinson and Spotted Tail's agency a few miles to the east. And so they were running several hundred head of cattle up there every week to feed the Indians, because under the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, that was part of the deal. For at least a number of years, the government would supply food and other goods to the native peoples in return for their moving to a permanent reservation. So they were slaughtered up there by the Indians much in the same way that they hunted bison. The cattle were turned out, the Indians chased them down on the prairie, shot them, cut them up, and turned in the hides if they wanted to. We have a little bit about that. We have actually an engraving from the Red Cloud Agency that was done by a correspondent in 1875 that actually represents this beef issue at Red Cloud Agency. It's pretty interesting, and you can see the buttes that we're all familiar with in the background. So it's the beef issue at Red Cloud. That'll be in the exhibit. Yes, sir.
Were there any cowgirls that worked the ranges?
The question was, were there any cowgirls that worked the ranges? And I guess I'd have to say, not in this period. There were no salaried women, at least Slatta doesn't suggest that there were, and I found no evidence of that. That doesn't mean that on a few of the ranches where there might have, the ranch owner's wife might have been present, that, or maybe some daughters, they wouldn't have helped out maybe in the bunkhouse or doing foods, preparing food for the cowboys if they came into the headquarters. But as best we know, there were no women employed as cowgirls in this period.
I know this is weird, but you mentioned the meal they had of oysters. Were they land oysters or sea oysters?
I think these were, the question was about the cowboys who were having their oyster supper. I'm pretty sure these were sea oysters, because this was in the fall. I don't think land oysters would have been available necessarily at that time. And secondly, even in the territorial years of Nebraska, in Omaha and cities that were on routes where you could ship goods in, they were consuming lots of oysters even in that early period. So, and of course, North Platte was on the railroad, so it wouldn't have been that hard to bring in oysters. So I think they were probably water oysters. Yes, sir.
The Texas cattle drives are such a big part of our American historical culture. They began about 1865, I believe, and they only lasted. That only went on till about 1885 or something, didn't it?
I think that the question was, or comment was, that the Texas cattle drives really didn't start till after the Civil War, about 1865, 66, and they only lasted for basically about 20 years, and I think that is correct. Oglala's big period when it was a cattle destination was basically 1875 to about 1884. There might have been a few coming up the next year. And there were some cattle drives maybe beyond that, but a lot of those were cattle being shipped up to farther north ranges in Montana or places. But yes, I think you're accurate in saying that the days of the stereotypical Texas trail drive with the longhorns coming along in the great cloud of dust was pretty short, maybe 20 years at the most. And the first drives from Texas came up mostly to Kansas destinations. And this was, of course, because the Civil War cut off Confederate Texas from any markets, so these cattle just kept increasing, and when the war was over, they had tons of cattle down there, and they also had a lot of Indians to feed, and of course, the nation was becoming increasingly industrialized. You had more need for food in the north, and so it all kind of came together. You had a tremendous supply and also an increasing demand. And the feasible way to do it was just drive them up to the railroads. And even some of you may know this, but for a year or two, Schuyler, Nebraska was a major destination, I think 1870. And then there were other drives that came to different places. Kearney, for a few years, was kind of the headquarters of the trail drives. But settlement kept going farther and farther west, and Nebraska had a herd law on the books, which basically said that if cattle broke into a farmer's cornfield, the cattle owner was liable for the damages. So they just kept moving the drives further and further west, trying to keep ahead of this tide of settlement. And they finally, even in Ogallala, failed to do that. It's interesting to note that even Cheyenne County, which was always one of the big cattle places, the voters of Cheyenne County voted in the herd law out there, I think in 1887, which sort of doomed the Bay State Company. So the next year is when the Cowboys were getting ready for the last roundup and moving their cattle over to Wyoming or Montana. Well, if there's nothing else, oh, there's still one? Okay, yeah, it's hard to see sometimes.
They also drove them up into, I believe, into eastern Colorado.
Sure.
I happen to know one of these old boys that it was a great uncle of my wife's that drove them up from Texas, and they drove to, I believe, about, well, west of Sterling, Colorado. And I had a question. Was Denver a market too for the cattle or not?
Well,
at that time,
it could have been. I'm not really sure because, again, I've kind of focused my attention on Nebraska. It wouldn't be unlikely that they would have had some markets.
There's a lot of cattle country, I think, yet.
Oh, indeed.
Eastern Colorado.
One of the biggest open range cattlemen was a man by the name of John Iliff, whose range was basically that whole northeastern corner of Colorado. So he shows up all the time. He was one of the leading early open range cattlemen, even before there was much going on here in Nebraska. So you'll find his name in the stories of open range ranching for sure. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question, or I wonder if you could explain how the Longhorns developed. Can you tell, like, a little bit of history where they actually came from?
Well, actually, I can tell you a little bit of what I've read about it in connection with this, that they're actually descendants of cattle that came, I think, on Columbus's second voyage, and these cattle were a mixture of stuff that I guess have DNA from, Pakistan and India and North Africa and all kinds of places. So they're really a mixture. And the reason I know that is just recently I read something about, there's some study going on somewhere maybe in Texas where they've actually been able to trace some of the Longhorn DNA back to some of its origins. They did also suggest in this study that probably the Longhorns evolved in terms of the predators these cattle found in the New World. So I don't know what they would have looked like exactly, but there's a registered Longhorn breed. I mean, it's been registered for a long time. So if you want to see a great herd of Longhorns, just come out to Fort Robinson. There's a fabulous herd roaming the side of the highway as you drive between Crawford and the fort.
Those are the originals, aren't they? They came from Valentine.
I believe so, or at least that herd was taken over there. And Dwayne, did you have a comment?
Well, one of the things she's talking about, they had a Longhorn herd they were trying to preserve them. This was after all, buffalo were wiped out and the longhorn were almost wiped out. And they were trying to preserve them, so they sent about half the cattle up here to Valentine Refuge. And the reason they did that was if sickness or something would happen in one herd, they'd still have the original strain in a separate herd.
Yeah.
And, which was very smart. And when they moved them up there, I was up there when they moved those cattle from the Valentine Refuge out to Fort Robinson. Man, I'll tell you, that was a cold, miserable jaunt.
Dwayne Fossler, he's among us as one of the last trail drivers that actually had that experience. So,
Well, I kinda didn't make it all the way. I had some problems. But before they took them on that drive, it was very nice out. And that night I hauled into Valentine, hauled my horse up there. Here they went, and the weather changed, and it was snowing and blowing, and it was. I woke up about 2 o'clock. I was sleeping out in the trailer in the bedroll, and I thought my canteen, it was pretty solid, so I took her down and put her in the bedroll with me. But it turned cold and nasty up there.
well, if you'd have read up on the history, you'd realize they did this trail driving stuff in the summer.
I didn't organize it.
Well, I show about 10 minutes till 1, so I guess I'll take one more question and then we'll call it a day.
Being we're here in Lincoln, do you know the story about the trail drive that comes through Lincoln?
Yeah, and there was a couple big herds that came up to Beatrice where I have
Oh, yeah.
newspaper accounts. So, I mean, there were, in the early period before the settlement really got extensive, there were herds coming up. There was a herd that was driven through Nebraska City in 1860 before the Civil War started, which we have some documentation. Well, again, thank you very much, and I hope you come and see the exhibit.